Welcome to Chancellorsville. The ground that I'm walking right now was the first day's battle, the first day's events as they came to a head here in Spotsylvania. General Hooker and his men had one of the most successful campaigns of the war coming to this location. General Hooker himself said, "May God have mercy on General Lee's soul, for I will have none." He was bragging and boasting and congratulating his men. And he had good reason for it. His men had come out here and had pretty much surprised General Lee and was on the left flank. And it looked as if Lee had to either leave his position or battle and be ultimately destroyed. Well, here on the ground that I'm at today, this is the first day's battle area that was preserved by the Battlefield Trust. In a short period of time here, on May 1st of 1863, General Sykes would be pushed forward and meet the Confederates here on this ground that I'm standing today, and within a few hours would lose a large number of men, and it would become very apparent that this wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. Eventually, over the course of 3 days, General Lee would be victorious, and the Army of Northern Virginia would make their way to Gettysburg. Now, off in the direction that I'm walking right now, the 16th, 6th, 61st, and 41st Virginia was actually stationed out here on this side during that first day's battle. And this was part of Mahone's brigade, or Mahone's unit, that Sykes ultimately met out here. The men on the Union side was the 14th U.S., 12th, 4th, 11th, 10th, 7th, 17th, 6th, and 2nd under General Sykes, with the 5th New York, 140th New York, and 146th New York. Eventually, they would have to fall back from their positions and cede the ground to the Confederates. Now, off to the rear here, you can see one of the main reasons why General Hooker was so psyched out about getting to this position as quickly as he did and getting to Lee's flank. Those trees back there, that's wintertime. It's cold out here. The leaves are falling. They're all but gone. And you have evergreens out there. Imagine it being completely leafed out. It's what they had to make their way through. They had to come through the wilderness to get out here. And they were able to do that in a rapid amount of time and get the advantage on someone who seemed to always have the advantage on his enemy, General Robert E. Lee. So when they got to this point and they were able to take the initiative and catch him off guard, it was very easy for General Hooker to believe that he had victory at hand. Just on the rise over my shoulder here, in this direction, there was a house that stood here that belonged to a Miss Ann Lewis. She lived there. She was here at the time during the battle, and she wrote and described the Yankees being in her house and on her porch. And she looked down the Orange Turnpike, which was just over here in front of me. And I'll turn the camera around so you can see the road, which is still here today. It's heavily used by vehicles. But she's standing here and she's watching all of this unfold. These people are taking over her house, and they're taking her corn, and they're taking her wheat, they're tearing down her fences, they're using it for fuel. And she looks down and she sees the butternut coming from the other direction, which is off in this direction here. And she looks back in the house and yells at the men inside, "Look at those rebels coming." And then she retreats down to the cellar. And in a matter of moments, from off in this direction over here, she is going to see and hear the tramping of thousands of feet from the Confederate Army as they're approaching this direction. And slowly, the battle starts to unfold. It must have been a crazy moment for them to be stuck here in the middle of all of this. And if you can put yourself in the mindset of being a civilian, not someone in the military expecting to hear gunshots or expecting to hear battle. And now it's come to your hometown, and it's here on these fields, and these are your fields, and everything's being destroyed. It must have been a frightening experience for those people. No matter which side they pulled for, it had to be frightening for them. Now the visitor center out here for the day one location, it has a decent sized parking lot. It's nothing huge. And there is a museum in there where they take donations, and it helps keep the history alive and keep things going. The trail that I'm on is roughly 2 miles, and it covers most of the locations here for the first day's battle. And here in just a moment, I'm going to turn the camera around and myself around, and right behind me you'll see the sunlight shining off the turn, or the orange turnpike that we were talking about earlier. Right there it is, where the cars are traveling. Now off in that direction there is where the Confederates are going to be coming from. And if you're on this rise here, like Miss Ann was, you're standing up over here and you're overlooking everything, and you can see the Confederates coming from that direction. The dust is kicking up in the wind, and long columns are marching over here. Lee, once again, even though he's outnumbered, knowing that the situation that he's in is probably close to destroying his army, he's still trying to take the initiative, still trying to press the issue, and trying to buy some time. Because initially what's going to happen here is they're going to fake an attack on the front. And then Jackson is going to come up with a plan that's going to split this army in half and take him on a long ride around the other side of the Union Army and surprise attack the flank of the Union Army, which almost all but collapses the Union Army in on itself. And eventually, Hooker and the United States Army is going to have to run in defeat. They're going to have to relocate, and something is going to have to happen later on, which eventually turns into Hooker being relieved of command, General George Gordon Meade taking over command, and the Gettysburg Campaign unfolds. At this point here, we're standing at the farthest point of the Union infantry from that advance on May 1st. And from here, the Federal troops poured a murderous fire into the disorganized Confederates. But soon after, General William Mahone and his men regrouped on the battle on the ridge just in front of us here. And a Union officer recalled that his men advanced steadily and with a will, although exposed to sharp fire from musketry and artillery. So, essentially, the initial shock of the fire from the Union soldiers quickly disorganized the Confederates from their approach, but with William Mahone and their experience, they were able to come back together, form a line on this ridge, and start battle. The Confederates' fire halted the Union attack almost immediately, and then the Federals fell back to the Lewis House, back where we were just at recently. For the Union troops, however, the battle soon took an unfortunate turn. Now let's talk about battlefield orientation. Directly out in front here, we're talking McLaws. McLaws is coming down the turnpike. And then you have Mahone's men, which are off on this, eventually off on this ridge line here. And then Sims and Kershaw are across the street over on this side over here. Where we're standing right now, you would have had Ayers, Burbank, and O'Rourke under Couch. And of course, Sykes. Let's kind of give you an idea, a directional idea of what all's going on. So now I'm up on that ridgeline that we were talking about where the Confederates would have advanced eventually. And if you can look behind me here, it's a hill down there. It's pretty steep. And then off in the distance is another ridgeline. So this whole area itself, as far as topography is concerned, it's a bunch of waving hills. It's up and down, up and down. So all day long, as these men are out here fighting each other, they're fighting against the elements. Imagine, it's May. It's a hot summer. You're in Virginia. There's a lot of humidity out here. And these young men are out here with all the gear on their bodies, heavy weaponry, and under intense situations, fighting each other, firing cannons and firing muskets at each other. The stress level alone is probably enough to make a person want to faint. And then you're going to add all of the heat and the pressure to the fighting. So it's really tough on the body. And then you add the hills and the terrain. It's a disaster waiting to happen physically. So it's pretty amazing what these men went through out here to fight each other. And it's just like many of the other battlefields and much of the terrain heading towards northern Virginia and up towards Gettysburg. This is a very unique circumstance for these soldiers to be in. Now when you get back down towards Petersburg, that area, it's not quite as up and down as these areas up here. The hills are not exactly as big. They're dealing with a different situation. And a lot of that is swampland. Now, General Lafayette McLaws recalls, the enemy were in force in my immediate front. The country was favorable for a flank attack. So he identified the fact that there was the possibility for a flank attack as well. And then someone yells flanked. It's something you don't want to hear when you're in the army and you're fighting. You don't want to hear that you're being flanked or outmaneuvered. When an army converges, and let's say you have a line of men like this. When we're talking about a flank, we're talking about the extreme side here. They're coming in towards the side. And if you noticed, I put out my handy dandy battle maps book from the Battlefield Trust. And if you join a membership with the American Battlefield Trust and you donate some money towards them, you too can have one of those books, and it'll help you out here on these battlefields. Now for some more battlefield orientation. So we have the turnpike here, running in this direction. And if you were here on that day when the Confederates advanced onto this ridge here, again, you're with McLaws, and you're on Mahone's side. Now across the street, lining up in those trees, in this direction, not in this direction, because the men here are lined up in this way. But across that street, lining up in the direction with the trees, was Rhodes. And he has Iverson, Doles, and Colquitt with him. And then kind of catty corner, if you can see in this direction, catty corner this direction here, you would have had O'Neill. And then Kershaw is off in the other direction across that street with Sims. And they're lined up over here. And again, we're facing Burbank, O'Rourke, and Ayers under Sykes. Couch's 2nd Corps. And they're off in this direction here. Eventually they fall back to where the Lewis farm is, which is right there on that ridge line. And then when they have to leave, they got to go down that hill and push back up in that direction. So that feared word we were talking about, flanked, we're essentially talking about the ability to fire down the line of the enemy. And if you're in that line, that converging fire comes down your line and not directly to your front, which means there's more of a chance for them to take out more of you by being able to do that. And it's devastating fire. Now, how did Rhodes get over into that tree line when we had men advancing from just behind us here, pushing towards Sykes? General Jackson. So General Jackson endeavored to take the rear of Sykes' men. And in order to do that, he had to take the Orange Plank Road, which is another road on the other side of those trees. And where we're at right now is the Orange Turnpike. He sends Rhodes around that side on the Orange Plank Road, and they come up on this side of the wooded area, and almost immediately they're on the flank of Sykes, and they're threatening to take the rear of Sykes. So naturally, Sykes is going to have to retreat. He's going to have to fall back. He can't allow them to wrap around behind him, and he can't allow him to take his flank, because if he does, it could be complete and total destruction of that force. Now, the Union soldiers have 133,000 roughly soldiers out here on the field, all in this direction. And you're thinking, well, that's a superior number. Why doesn't the Union just push their men forward and win the day? It's easier said than done. The logistics of it, just to get the soldiers over here in place, would have taken the entire day, if not more. And Jackson was really good at getting around smaller units and hitting them with larger numbers so that he could piecemeal the army and take it by force. And these surprise small attacks is really what wins the day out here in Chancellorsville for the entire battle. And unfortunately for Jackson and the Confederate Army, he ends up injured out here, which eventually he has pneumonia, and the pneumonia takes his life. And after that, a lot of the people in the Confederate Army say that things weren't quite the same without Jackson in charge of his unit. His men hated him for his work, but they loved him for his victory. Now, here in a moment, I'm about to go from this cleared open fields to interior portion of where these trees and the tangled brush is. And you'll see how quickly we lose sight of the road behind us and how dense this stuff is, even in the fall and winter time, with the leaves being gone. And that's what we were talking about earlier, as we were talking about Hooker's men having to come through the wilderness. Eventually, there would be a battle out in the wilderness. And that's a whole nother story. And that fight, there would be a lot of lives lost due to brush fire. But we'll talk about that on another day. Now, if you get the chance to come out here and walk this field, I highly recommend it. But be warned, it is all of 2 miles. Come out here during the cooler times of the year, if you're not accustomed to the heat, and check this place out. It makes the walking a little bit easier. If you come out here during the summertime, dress light and put a lot of bug spray on, because you will be picking up ticks out here. Walking out here during this last summer was quite the adventure, and needless to say, I needed a tall, cool drink after it was over with. We're approaching an area where a few families lived out here in Spotsylvania, the Chancellorsville area. The McGee family and the Silver family. For many years after the American Civil War is over with, those names were as synonymous as mud. The area knew them as spies, but not Confederate spies, spies for the Union Army. Isaac Silver would come out here and annotate in pencil how many men were out here, the locations of the camps, the strength of the armies, and then he would pass along a note to McGee, who would eventually make his way across to the Union Army and let them know with pretty good accuracy what to expect out here, which, if Hooker had any sort of success out here, that would have been invaluable information. Unfortunately for Hooker, the campaign did not turn out to be the greatest, and so the information really wasn't that great. Eventually, one of them goes on to die, fatally wounded, probably while carrying out the duties of being a spy in 1864, and the other one continues to live on. But it just goes to show at that time, it wasn't just the armies that were at play. The entire society was at play. And people like McGee and Silver made a difference. Out in front of me here, if you can kind of see down the hill, out there was Mott's Run. Today it's called Lick Run. The Union soldiers, I've probably walked close to a mile now, and the Union soldiers were being pushed back in this direction because they were being outflanked, they were being outmaneuvered. And General Sims noted that the road and the woods and fields on either side over which the enemy retired were strewn with knapsacks, blankets, overcoats, and many other valuable articles, meaning that the Union Army was on the run, and anything that they were carrying out here on these fields that would slow them down, they threw off their shoulders. They did not want to be slowed down. Essentially, they did not want to get killed while running because they were too slow. Captain Marsh faced around in his horse, and he was holding his sword aloft, and he looked at his men and he said, "Steady there, boys, don't run." But as he uttered those last words, he was struck off his horse, and somewhere out here on this field, the captain fell, mortally wounded. Now time for some battlefield orientation. So what you're looking at in front here right down there, you can probably see it even better, is the run that we're talking about that runs off in this direction. That's a waterway, okay? Burbank, Ayers, and O'Rourke have now retreated back to this direction. Sims, Mahone, and Kershaw, Colquitt, Doles, Iverson, and Rhodes are all pursuing, and they're pushing in the same directions we talked about. We have them lined up on the road here pushing this way, and Mahone and his men are coming from over on that ridge down to this portion, and they're headed back towards us here. This is a deadly field of fire that these Union soldiers are now having to retreat downhill and towards that direction. And I guess the only thing that's working for them right now is that they're having to run downhill and not uphill. But eventually, when you get to the other side of this run and you look in that direction, what do you see up there? A nice tall hill. Now looking just over my shoulder here, you can see the direction from which I came and from which the Confederate Army was pushing the Union Army. Off in this direction here, out in the distance there, you can just make out the ridge line that we initially started with that small barn out there. And that's where the Confederates initially started their attack. Then they pushed, shoved them down one hill, back up another, across the run here, and then up this massive hill that's behind me, over my shoulders here. I've already gone up most of that hill, and there's only more hills after that. So I'll flip the camera around and I'll show you the positioning based on the view. Now again, we're talking about day one. If you look off in the distance right over here, that's that small barn where the Confederates were posted along the ridge line coming towards the Union soldiers on that farthest advance. Then that small hill right out in front here, the open space in between the barn out there, that is where the Lewis farm would have been posted, right out in this area. And then there's another hill that's directly in front of us right before you get to the run. That's the next advance line where the Confederates then pushed the Union soldiers. They had to come across this run, up this hill, and eventually make their way up and over this hill. Now that we're at the top of this hill, I want to talk about two of the units that fought out here and were trying to escape the Confederates. The 5th and 146th New York. One unit was very green, and the other unit was a more superior unit. Confederates didn't care. They didn't care which unit was green or not. They were going to hound them all the way up to this hill and try to capture them en masse if they could. In which that's what they did with a lot of those soldiers. Colonel Kenner Gerard was in charge of the 146th, and these men were struggling to try to get up this hill and across that run that's directly behind me there. And the amount of stress that they were under, you can imagine, it was a scary sight for them coming up on this hill and seeing all those Confederate soldiers pouring into the field and their men just running everywhere. But then out comes Hancock. Once again, Hancock shows up on the scene to save the day. And in the ridges in front of me here, you can imagine you're with the 146th, you're running for your life, you've just escaped the clutches of the Confederate soldiers, and you see Hancock's men standing on that hill, ready to protect your retreat. That's what he did. Hancock and his men came out here, they protected the retreat, they were able to make their way back to Chancellorsville, and then everything else unfolds from there. And that, in a nutshell, kind of covers what happens on day one here in this location. in the Spotsylvania area for the Chancellorsville battle. And one of the things I like about going out to battlefields like this and traveling to these places is generally organizations like the American Battlefield Trust and the Civil War Trails system. They put signs up, they put interpretive trails, places that you can go to, walk the grounds, and understand for yourself what happened in these locations. You don't have to be a historian to do that. You don't have to be an expert. You just have to be a traveler, just like myself. Get out there and check these places out, read the signs, and interpret the topography for yourself and the location of the soldiers where they fought. It will give you a better understanding of how these battles unfolded, even when you're surrounded on a battlefield with things like this. All those houses. It can make it hard for you to determine exactly what happened, where it happened, at what point and what time. But lucky for you and me, the Civil War Trails and the American Battlefield Trust have made it a lot easier. So go check it out. If you see one of those signs out there, stop, take a look, learn some history today. Along this interpretive trail, there's a marker out here that talks about the McGee family. All along the ridgeline here and across Lick Run, which is just over the other side of that hill, the McGee family, the extended McGee family, and people that were related to the McGee family lived out here during the time of the Civil War. Reuben McGee, who was the patriarch, lived just behind me on the opposite side of Lick Run. Among Reuben's 5 members, his 5 sons were ardent Confederates: Reuben McGee Jr., 2 Southern Army deserters, Robert McGee and Sanford McGee, 1 Union spy, which we talked about earlier, Ebenezer McGee, and 1 with Union sympathies, Absalom McGee. And he lived just 2 steps farther along this trail of where we're going today. This post-war cemetery that we're looking at right now is the final resting place for 11 members of the extended McGee family. Absalom McGee, his wife, Frances, 2 of their daughters, and a daughter-in-law are buried here. The other 6 graves belong to members of the Timberlake family who were connected to the McGees by marriage. This is history. That's what it's all about right there. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our video on day 1 here at Chancellorsville at the American Battlefield Trust's location and the explanation of what happened out here in these fields. It was a real hard-fought battle, and eventually the entire battle turns into a Confederate victory, with Hooker being injured, the Confederates pressing the Union Army out of this location, and eventually the campaign to Gettysburg, which ultimately ends in a Confederate defeat and Robert E. Lee even saying that he should probably step aside. Onward with day 2. It's been fun taking you here. This is History with Waffles.